right, and we're going to jump in to Acts 25. We're almost done with the book of Acts. We really only have a couple of weeks left in the book of Acts. We'll be picking up where we left off in Acts 25 today is where we are. And after we go through a couple more weeks of the book of Acts to finish it up, we're going to jump into the book of Romans next. So we're going to go from quite a book of narration and showing a big story of people's lives throughout a large course of time to going to a book like Romans that is very deep in teaching and theology and so many of the truths that we need to know to live by. So it'll be quite a change going from the book of Acts to the book of Romans, but that's what we're going to do next. All right, picking up in the book of Acts chapter 25, Paul has already finished his 3 missionary trips around the known world through modern-day Turkey into Greece and Achaia and all of those regions and some islands. And he finished that up, and his heart was to go witness to his people back in Jerusalem, and he did that. And, of course, they arrested him for it. Without cause, they arrested him in Jerusalem. And then the Romans had to intervene, and they spared him. And in chapter 24, we saw we saw in the earlier chapters, before we got to chapter 24, how the Jews were beating him, and the Romans had to come in Jerusalem and save him out of the mob, and they kept him until there could be a hearing or a cause. In chapter 24, then, when Paul was sent down to Caesarea, he stood before the Roman governor, I'm going to get this right, Felix at the time, because there's another governor coming. And so in chapter 24, he stood before the Roman governor Felix. And we saw that Felix really wanted nothing more but a bribe from Paul to be able to get loosed from jail and to be set free. He was just looking to make a buck, make a profit on this situation. And it was interesting, though, that every step of the way, as Paul gets to be in front of somebody, whether they're a nobody or whether they're an important person like a governor or a king or the high priest, Paul wants to take every opportunity to share the gospel and to share Christ and his resurrection with them. And so last time we were together, as Paul was sharing with the governor Felix, we noted how it said in chapter 24 that Felix trembled as he heard the gospel. And we know that he ultimately didn't accept the gospel. He, in fact, left Paul in jail. As Felix left his office of being a governor, getting recalled back to Rome, Festus is going to take his place. His name's Porcius Festus. And Festus is the one who comes on the scene as the new governor in Acts chapter 25. So that's where we're going to pick it up today. So Felix, the former governor, left Paul in jail to do the Jews a favor, to try to show favor or pleasure to the Jews. So Paul is still there when Porcius Festus comes into office to be the new governor in the whole region of Judea. So the palace for the governor at the time was in Caesarea along the coast. And of course, Jerusalem was the capital for the Jews and where their high priest was and where their Sanhedrin was. But the governor stayed in Caesarea along the coast. So in chapter 25 today, Paul stands before the governor Festus, who has just come into office. And in many of these provinces around Rome, like Judea, these governors didn't stand much time. Festus himself, who has just taken the office of governor, he's only going to be the governor there for 3 or 4 years at the most, and then even he's going to be gone. So it's a short-term situation that these governors face, especially if you're in a contentious region like Judea with these troublesome Jews that they have to deal with. So Paul's been arrested. But what was he arrested for? Is it because he broke Jewish laws? Did he break Roman laws? No, but the accusations against him were both that he broke Jewish laws and somehow profaning the temple, which he didn't, profaning the law, which he didn't. And then the accusations they made against him that he was a seditious person trying to raise up an insurrection, trying to raise up a rebellion against Rome, which he didn't. So all of these accusations have come out that he has broken the law of the Jews and the law of the Romans, but he's done neither. The only thing he's done is he's believed the claims of Jesus Christ. That is his crime that the Jews are trying to find an earthly crime to get him in trouble with. So this is Paul's claim. The whole time, that is what he's holding on to, that he's unwilling to let go of. He claims Christ. And that's the name of the message today, is name him and claim him. You know, you've heard of the name it and claim it and, you know, prosperity gospel and blab it and grab it, whatever they want to call it. So we're going to name this one, Name Him and Claim Him. Because that is what Paul's life is anchored in naming Christ before men and claiming him. That is what he stands for. He claims the resurrection of Christ is legitimate, and he stakes his life on it. And that's what we need to do too. So what kind of claims are we living our life staked on? What are we living for? Because if you don't accept the claims of Christ in your life, then you will stake your life on some other claim, some other false truth, or some other earthly truth that only makes sense here, and then it's temporary and it's gone. And so Paul is living his life on the claims of Christ. And even today, as he stands before the new governor, Festus, I'm going to get this right. At some point, I'm going to say Felix from last chapter. Okay, it's Festus. I might call him Porcius Festus on purpose, just to say the whole thing so I get it right. Festus is the new governor today. Even as he stands before Festus, this is all Paul wants to get across. I stand for Jesus Christ. And he has changed Paul's life. So we're going to, as we go through the chapter 25, we're going to see 4 reactions to the claims of Christ. So we'll kind of outline it that way as we go through the chapter. And the first one we're going to see in chapter 25, as it opens up in the first 8 verses, is how the Jews deny the claims of Christ. They don't want to think about the claims of Christ. So they deny the claims of Christ. And the way they do that is they throw out unprovable claims of their own against Paul. So they claim, Paul did this, Paul did that, but they can't even prove it. They're just trying to grasp onto something to get him in trouble and to stop him. Does that sound familiar, Christian? Because as you're busy about serving the Lord, there will be times that people will throw out false claims against you and say, yeah, well, you know, it's almost as if they don't want to talk about Christianity. So when you bring up Christianity, they want to bring up something. Yeah, well, I saw you show up late for work the other day. It's like, what? Some people will intentionally try to turn a blind eye to Christ by bringing up some accusation against you. And that's continually what the Jews try to do against Paul. So open up to chapter 25, and we'll begin in verse 1. Now when Festus was come into the province, after 3 days he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul, and besought him, and desired favor against him, that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him. So Festus has only been the governor for 3 days, but he goes to Jerusalem because he wants to be in good favor with the Jews. He's going to run this province filled with these Jews. He wants to know about them. He wants to start up good relations with them. Now, of all the items, of all of the things on the docket, of all of the things in the agenda that the Jews could bring up to him, what is it that they bring up? You know, picture this. Porcius Festus comes into Jerusalem for the first time. I'm your new governor. And what do they bring up? You have this guy in Caesarea in prison, and we'd like for you to bring him back here to Jerusalem so we can try him. That's what they bring up. That's the item that's so important to them. You know, history records that at this time, the only other issue that Porcius Festus had to deal with the Jews was that the Jews had created a retaining wall to block the view of King Agrippa from seeing down into a certain part of the temple. And King Agrippa wanted the wall gone, but the Jews wanted to continue building this wall to block his view because they didn't want him to see into what they were doing in the temple for many reasons. And so this is the only other event that history records that was a contentious item between Porcius Festus, the new governor, and these Jews. But here, as they meet him for the first time, what do they bring up? You've got this prisoner, Paul. and we want him gone. And they bring that up. And why is it? And it explains to us in verse 3 that they're literally trying to kill Paul when he comes back to Jerusalem. They're looking for a way that in his journey back from Caesarea to Jerusalem, they can kill him. That's what it means when it says they're lying in wait in the way to kill him. The Jews want Paul gone at any cost. So when they talk about bring Paul back so we can try him in our trial, it's just a cover for them to kill him. That's all they want. Continue in verse 4. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea and that he himself would depart shortly there. So Felix is saying that, not Felix, Festus is saying that he's going to go back to Jerusalem and that he can be tried back there. In verse 5, let them, therefore, said he, which among you are able to go down with me and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him. And verse 6, and when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about, and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. So Festus said, if you want to have another trial for this guy, you come down to Caesarea and we will do it in Caesarea. And sure enough, they are willing to take the trip down to Caesarea to accuse Paul. And what do they accuse him with? In verse 7, they come against Paul with unprovable charges. They can't even prove. And we saw in the last chapter or two the different things that they were accusing Paul with. Breaking the law, blaspheming the temple, creating an insurrection and a rebellion against Rome. All of these things, and they bring it all up again, and they couldn't prove any of it. All of it was just made up charges to get this guy gone. They are so scared of what he stands for, what he believes, that they want it gone. This idea of a resurrected Messiah is more dangerous to them than a revolt physically against Rome. Laying these charges against Paul, this is their way of denying the claims of Christ. Their method is just simply discount, deny, destroy, get rid of the messenger. If they can't destroy Paul's message of resurrection, then let's destroy Paul. Let's get rid of him. That's the only way they can get rid of it. Guys, even 2,000 years later, that is the only method the devil has to try to stop Christ, is to try to get rid of and discredit the messengers. The message stands. The message stands. There are famous missionaries that have said, go ahead and kill me. It doesn't change the fact that the message stands. The message will continue to go out. And you can see a confidence here in Paul that he knows that. Like, well, who am I? But the message will continue to go out. Verse 8 finishes this section. While he answered for himself, neither, and this is Paul's answer, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all. So Paul reminds them of his innocence. He's continued in all of these other defenses of his to say, not only have I not offended against the Jews or their religion, not only have I not offended against Rome or their laws, I'm here only because of the resurrection of the dead. And he said that every chance he's had, particularly in the last chapter, chapter 24, when he was standing before the governor Felix. He said, I'm not here because I've broken any laws. I'm here because I believe in the resurrection of the dead. And he continues with that theme. That's why I'm here. So, as it picks up in verse 9, Festus, the new governor, is going to challenge Paul and say, okay, well, if you're innocent, why don't you go to Jerusalem then and stand before these Jews in a trial? And look at what his answer is going to be. So this next section with Festus is going to show us how the Jews try to dissuade people away from the claims of Christ with unanswerable claims. Not just are the claims that they throw against Paul unprovable claims that they are making, but they're also unanswerable by Paul. What could Paul do to possibly get out of their trap is the point, okay? So this is another method of these Jews to try to discount the claims of Christ, is they try to accuse Paul of things that there's no way for him to get out of. Look at verse 9. But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, will you go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before me? So he would be the judge, but it would be in Jerusalem with all of the Jews accusing him. Verse 10, then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done nothing wrong, as you very well know. In verse 11, for if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, then I refuse not to die. If there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, then no man can deliver me unto them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, or his council of Romans, he answered and said, have you appealed to Caesar? Then unto Caesar you will go. The Caesar at this time was a Nero. Nero is probably known as the most vicious of, and probably the most insane Caesar that they've ever had. So Paul's right as a Roman citizen was to appeal to Roman law. And he does. He does. So Paul, it's interesting that Paul trusted Roman justice more than he did Jewish justice. Look, the Romans were lots of things, including pretty cruel, but they had a justice system that even our American law is based on today. The idea that you have to, that your accusers have to face you. The idea that you have to have a trial before you can be convicted. Many of the premises of our American judicial system is based in Rome. And Paul trusted the Roman system more than the Jews. Paul knew it, that if he went to Jerusalem to be judge of the Jews, he would be killed. They would find a way to pin things on him that he didn't do. He knew that, right? Look again at verse 11, because verse 11 said, if I was an offender and I've committed something worthy of death, then I refuse not to die. Paul says, look, I'm innocent. If I was guilty, then I would be willing to be justifiably punished. But I haven't done anything. He's okay with justice. Paul is living with such a clean conscience. Do you live that way, where you can walk into a situation and you could say, look, do whatever let's bring on the justice, because I'm innocent. I didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes we live in guilt, and we're constantly not honest about a situation. And if justice comes, like, oh, there's an inspector coming. Oh, no, clean up everything, But if you're living in a clean conscience and open, and somebody says the judge is coming, you're like, great, bring him in. This is going to be good. They're going to see how good we are. That's Paul's perspective. He's living in such an open, clear conscience before God. He's like, if I was guilty, I would be willing to die. But I'm not. I'm not guilty. So I will not go face these Jews and be put to death for something I didn't do. And here's the other interesting thing about this. Do you remember that a few chapters ago, when Paul was first put into prison, Jesus Christ came and stood by him in prison, in the jail? Do you remember that? And what did Christ tell him? It's back in chapter 23, if you want to look at it. It's verse 11 of chapter 23. And Jesus came to him and said, be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified of me here in Jerusalem, so must you bear witness also in Rome. So Paul is thinking right now, when Festus says, do you want to go back to Jerusalem and face Jewish justice? Paul's thinking, no, I don't. In fact, since I already know that the Lord's destiny for me is to go to Rome, let's get this show on the road. I appeal to Caesar. Let's go. And sure enough, Festus says, okay, you appeal to Caesar? That's your right. To Caesar you will go. They were out for blood, these Jews. And Paul knew it. Paul knew there's nothing he could do to answer their claims. There's nothing he could do to get out of that situation. This was the Jewish method of dissuading people from listening to the claims of Christ. Just destroy Paul's reputation. Destroy him, make him look like an evildoer. They wanted to shut him up. Whether in prison or in death, they wanted him quiet. Whatever it took. It reminds me of there's a story of Elijah in the Old Testament. And when Ahab the king is on the throne, one of the most wicked kings there was in all of Israel ever. And so in the book of 1 Kings chapter 18, there's an interesting way that King Ahab puts this. So King Ahab is the wicked idolater, and his wife Jezebel. And Elisha is the prophet of God. And I want you to hear the missed perspective, the way that things are seen wrong here. It's 1 Kings chapter 18. Let's see if I can find it. I'm going to pick up maybe just in verse 17. So this is the first sighting Ahab has of Elijah. And it says, "It came to pass when Ahab saw Elijah, that Ahab said unto him, Are you he that troubleth Israel?" And Elijah's answer, he answered and said, "I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house, in that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and you have followed Balaam." And he goes on from there to tell Ahab what the trouble really is, that Ahab has caused. But I just find it so interesting that so often the tables get turned and they want you to think you're the one causing the trouble. You're the one causing the stress. You know, everybody just wants peace. Oh, I just don't want an argument. And to a certain extent, the Christian's job is to present an argument. Because everybody is born in their sin. Everybody is born headed to hell. Right? Born once, die twice. Born twice, die only once. We're born headed for hell. And the Christian has to interject in that situation and say, you don't have to continue doing that. You can change. The Lord can save you out of that. And that produces stress. That produces an argument. It produces anxiety. And what does the world want? They just want the stress gone. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to think about it. Just get rid of it. Don't let me think about it. And that's what the Jews are trying to do. And so Elijah was on the scene in front of this wicked King Ahab, and all Ahab can see is, that's the guy that gives me all this stress. No, he's the guy that's trying to get rid of the idolatry. He's the one who's trying to get people to see Christ and to get saved and to turn to the living God. And the same with Paul right here. All these Jews can see is this Paul is the one stirring up all this trouble. They said of Paul earlier on in the book of Acts, he's turning the world upside down. That's what they said of Paul. I would say that Paul was trying to right the world back the right way, the way it should have been. So when the world speaks, they see it in the wrong perspective, as if the world is currently right and Paul's trying to turn it upside down. Whereas the Christian would say, no, the world is currently upside down, and we're trying to right it. And these Jews are just saying, like,